In late February 2026, in a quiet Tucson neighborhood, something unusual was happening. Police vehicles were parked outside a home, not Nancy Guthrie's, not the place where she was taken, but another house entirely. Investigators moved in and out without urgency, but with precision. Evidence bags were carried out carefully, one at a time. No chaos, no noise. Just a quiet kind of tension that suggested this wasn't routine. Because by then, most people still believed the answers were at Nancy's home. That's where the blood had been found. That's where the camera had been removed. That's where everything began. The investigation had already moved on. This wasn't a follow-up. It was a shift. And it led straight to a house connected to the last person known to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive. At first, that detail doesn't seem unusual. In most cases, the last person is always questioned, always looked at closely. But then comes the part that changes how you hear everything that follows. This wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a sluchiny encounter. It was her son-in-law, someone who had been inside that home before, someone who knew the family, the routines, the space, someone who didn't need to guess. And suddenly, the investigation doesn't feel the same anymore. Because family is supposed to be the safest place, but in some cases, it's also the closest place to the truth. So why did investigators shift their focus here? What did they see or learn that made this house more important than the crime scene itself? Do you think cases like this are more often inside jobs or random crimes? Nancy Guthrie's life, by all visible accounts, was built on routine. At 84, she lived alone in her Tucson home, a place she had grown familiar with over time, where every room held a kind of quiet predictability. The same doors locked at night, the same lights left on or turned off, the same movements day after day, shaped not by uncertainty, but by comfort. And that kind of life creates something important. Not weakness, but trust. Because when a routine becomes stable, it also becomes invisible. It no longer feels like something that needs to be protected. It becomes something you rely on, something you assume will always be there. For older adults especially, those routines rarely change. In interviews and case studies, it's often noted that predictability increases with age, not out of limitation, but out of preference. Familiar patterns become a form of safety. But predictability has another side. It can be learned, it can be observed, and eventually, it can be used. The person now at the center of attention didn't need to study Nancy's life from a distance. He wasn't trying to piece together fragments from the outside. He was already part of that environment. He was family. A son-in-law doesn't raise the same alarms as a stranger. He doesn't stand out. He doesn't need to explain why he's there. His presence fits into the structure of the home without resistance. Over time, that kind of proximity creates a level of familiarity that goes beyond surface details. It becomes internal. A stranger, by contrast, would have to work for that knowledge. They would need to watch, to learn, to take risks, just to understand the basics: where to enter, when someone might be alone, how long they could remain undetected. But an insider doesn't have to guess. They already know. They know which doors are used and which ones aren't, which entry points might go unnoticed, which parts of the house are visible from outside, and which are not. They know where the camera is placed, what it captures, what it misses. They know where Nancy slept. They know what was beside her bed. They know about the pacemaker monitor, where it sits, how it functions when it transmits. These aren't details you discover in a single moment. They are absorbed over time, without intention, simply by being present. And that changes everything. Because once that level of knowledge exists, the nature of an intrusion shifts. It's no longer about forcing entry or testing possibilities. It becomes something else entirely. It becomes execution. No hesitation, no trial and error, no need to adapt in real time. Just movement through a space that already feels familiar. Some analysts have suggested that in cases involving this kind of proximity, the difference isn't just opportunity, it's efficiency. The ability to act without drawing attention, because nothing about the movement appears out of place. But even that raises a deeper question, because access alone doesn't explain what happened. Knowing a house isn't the same as planning what to do inside it. Understanding routines isn't the same as turning them into a sequence of actions. Access, creates possibility. But possibility still requires intent. And somewhere between familiarity and action, something changed. Because someone didn't just know this environment, they used it. Access is one thing. Execution is something else entirely. So the question becomes harder, more specific, and more unsettling. If someone had that level of knowledge, if they understood the space, the timing, the details, then how was that knowledge actually used? The night of January 31st begins in the most ordinary way possible. At around 9:50 p.m., Nancy Guthrie is dropped off at her home. There's nothing unusual about it. No signs of distress. No indication that anything is about to happen. Just a routine moment, the kind that disappears into memory without a second thought. That's what makes it so important, because it becomes the last confirmed point where everything was still normal. After that, the timeline goes quiet. For nearly 4 hours, there is nothing. No alerts from the home, no visible disturbances, no calls that suggest anything is wrong. Just silence stretching from late evening into the early hours of the morning. And in investigations like this, silence isn't empty. It's space. Space where something could have been set in motion. Space where preparation could take place without interruption. Where decisions are made, movements are planned, and timing is calculated. Some analysts have noted that in cases involving deliberate action, the absence of activity can be just as meaningful as the presence of it, because nothing happening can mean something is waiting. Then, at 1:47 a.m., that silence breaks. A figure appears at Nancy's front door, masked, gloved, moving with a kind of precision that immediately stands out. There's no hesitation, no visible uncertainty, no signs of someone figuring things out as they go. The movement is direct, controlled, confident, and that detail matters, because it doesn't look like someone encountering the space for the first time. There's no exploratory behavior, no checking, no second guessing, just action, which suggests familiarity. Then comes the moment that changes how that footage is understood. The doorbell camera isn't just avoided, it's removed, physically taken off the wall. That decision goes beyond concealment. It's not just about staying unseen, it's about controlling what exists afterward, controlling what can be reviewed, analyzed, replayed. In a way, it's not just an action against the present, it's an action against the future. A deliberate attempt to shape the narrative before anyone else even knows something has happened. And then, at 2:28 a.m., another signal is missed. Nancy's pacemaker, normally transmitting as part of its routine monitoring, goes silent. It's a technical detail, but it carries weight, because it marks a moment where something that should have continued didn't. For investigators, that timestamp becomes more than data. It becomes a boundary, a line between what was and what is no longer accounted for. When you place all of this together, the last normal moment, the extended silence, the precise arrival, the removal of the camera, the final missed signal, the timeline begins to feel less like a sequence of random events and more like something structured. Not proof, not a conclusion, but a frame, an opportunity window where everything could have happened. And that's where the tension lives, because a timeline like this doesn't tell you who did it, but it tells you what was possible. And sometimes, that's enough to change the direction of an entire investigation. But even then, the timeline isn't the most unusual part of this case. Because what came next, what was discovered outside of that night, raises an even more difficult question. As investigators continued to examine what surrounded that night, certain details began to shift, not because they were new, but because they were being seen differently. One of the most discussed elements was the possibility of a signal jammer. At first glance, it sounds like something out of a more sophisticated operation. A device designed to block or interfere with wireless signals, cameras, alarms, anything that relies on communication to function. It's not something most people own. It's not something someone stumbles into using without intention. It requires planning. It requires understanding. And most importantly, it requires knowing why you would need it in the first place. That's where the meaning begins to change. Because this isn't just about a smart criminal using advanced tools. It's about someone who knew exactly what kind of system they were dealing with and prepared specifically for it. Someone who didn't just react to what they encountered, but anticipated it, which suggests something else quietly underneath. Familiarity. Then there are the digital searches. Investigators uncovered that images of Nancy Guthrie's home had been searched online on 2 separate occasions, once months earlier, and then again closer to the time of her disappearance. The kind of searches that show the exterior of the property, the angles, the approach from the street. For a stranger, that behavior fits. Someone unfamiliar with the home would need to study it. They would need to understand how to approach, what could be seen, what couldn't. It's a logical step in planning. But for someone already familiar with the house, the meaning changes. Why search for something you've already seen, unless the goal wasn't to learn the house, but to confirm something about it? A camera position, a line of sight, a change in the environment that needed to be verified before moving forward. Some analysts later suggested that this kind of behavior often appears in the later stages of planning, not when someone is first learning, but when they are preparing to act. Checking details, eliminating uncertainty. And that's where the second interpretation becomes harder to ignore, because what looks like preparation from the outside can look like confirmation from the inside. Then there are the ransom notes. From the beginning, they stood apart not just because they existed, but because of how they were written. These weren't vague or generic demands sent without direction. They were specific, focused, designed to reach the right people in the right way. They didn't just ask for money. They applied pressure that seemed to understand exactly who would feel it most, who would respond first, who would be emotionally driven to act quickly, without hesitation. In some discussions, it was suggested that the tone of the messages reflected more than just intent. It reflected awareness, an understanding of family dynamics that would be difficult for an outsider to replicate convincingly. Because this wasn't just communication. It was influence, the kind that doesn't just deliver a message but shapes a reaction. Taken one at a time, each of these elements could still be explained. A tool that might or might not have been used. Searches that could have multiple meanings. Messages that could be interpreted in different ways. But when they begin to align, something changes. A pattern starts to emerge. Planning, familiarity, control. Not random movement, but structured steps. Not isolated decisions, but a sequence building toward a specific outcome. And yet, for all of that, everything, so far, remains indirect. Interpretations, possibilities, inferences drawn from behavior and timing. The kind of evidence that suggests direction but doesn't settle it. Because the most direct part of this case isn't found in theory. It's found in what investigators were looking for when they entered that house, and what they chose to take out with them when they left. By the time investigators moved in on that house, the case had already crossed an invisible line. This was no longer the early phase, no longer about securing a scene, collecting whatever might be there, and building from scratch. What unfolded instead looked very different. Multiple locations tied to Nancy Guthrie were being searched at the same time. Not one after another, not cautiously expanding outward, but simultaneously. That kind of coordination usually signals something specific. It means the investigation has advanced. It means separate threads, timeline, digital traces, behavioral patterns have reached a point where they need to be tested together, in real time. Not guessed at, not theorized, tested. Because when investigators believe they understand how pieces connect, they don't just look for more evidence. They go looking for confirmation. And that's what this felt like. Not a random search. A hypothesis being checked. At the house itself, that intention became even clearer in how the search was conducted. This wasn't a broad sweep. It wasn't investigators moving through every room equally, hoping to stumble onto something important. They focused. Specific areas drew more attention than others. Time wasn't evenly distributed. It was concentrated. Certain parts of the house held investigators longer, suggesting those spaces mattered more within whatever theory they were working from. And then there was what came out. Items weren't removed casually. They weren't gathered in bulk. They were selected one by one, documented, handled carefully, and taken away as part of a larger evidentiary chain. In cases like this, that kind of pattern usually reflects something internal, a mental checklist, not written down, not visible to anyone watching from the outside, but present. Investigators often enter a location with a working framework already in mind, a sense of what might be there, where it might be, and why it matters. And when their movements align that closely with that framework, when they go directly to certain areas, spend more time there, and remove items with precision, it suggests they aren't searching blindly. They're verifying. That's where the tone begins to shift. Descriptions that emerged afterward used words like disturbing and not routine. And in law enforcement language, those words aren't thrown around lightly. They don't usually describe surprise. They describe recognition. Moments when something found doesn't just add information, it reinforces a direction the investigation was already heading. Because the most unsettling part of a discovery isn't always what it is. It's what it confirms. Some observers later pointed out that experienced investigators rarely react dramatically in the moment. They don't need to. By the time they step inside a location like this, they already have context. They already understand what certain findings could mean. So, when something is described as disturbing, it often reflects something deeper than shock. It reflects alignment, a piece falling into place. And yet, publicly, there was no immediate explanation, no detailed breakdown of what had been recovered, no press conference outlining exactly what had been found inside that house. Just silence. But not the kind of silence that suggests nothing happened, the kind that suggests something did. In many investigations, there's a moment where the narrative begins to shift quietly without announcements, without headlines catching up right away. It happens internally first, through actions, through decisions about where to search, what to take, and what to test next. That's what this looked like, a silent conclusion forming beneath the surface. Because if investigators moved this way, if they coordinated across multiple locations, focused their search so precisely, and removed items with that level of intention, then whatever they were looking for may not have been a mystery to them at all. It may have been expected, and whatever they found may have confirmed something they had been building toward for weeks or even months. What do you think they found? Because whatever was inside that house may not have started there. It may trace back to something much earlier, something that began long before that night ever unfolded. As the investigation moves forward, what begins to emerge isn't a single breakthrough, but a pattern. Not something obvious at first, not something that points cleanly in one direction, but something that becomes clearer the more each piece is placed beside the others. Because in cases like this, investigators don't just look for evidence, they look for consistency. They look for a type of person who could exist across all the facts. And that's where behavioral profiling comes in. Not to accuse, not to name someone, but to define capability. The kind of individual who could carry out something this controlled would need three things working together: knowledge, planning, and emotional targeting. Knowledge first. Not surface-level familiarity, but something deeper, an understanding of the environment that allows movement without hesitation. Knowing where to go without searching. Knowing what matters and what doesn't. That kind of knowledge doesn't come quickly. It's built over time. Then planning. Not impulsive behavior, not a reaction, but a sequence. The timeline itself suggests that events spaced with intention, actions taken at precise moments, the possible use of tools. The earlier digital searches, these aren't isolated. They suggest preparation that started well before that night. And finally, emotional targeting. The ransom messages weren't just demands, they were directed, structured in a way that seemed to anticipate how the family would react, who would feel pressure, who would respond. That kind of communication reflects more than intent. It reflects understanding. When those three elements, knowledge, planning, and emotional awareness, exist together, they don't just describe behavior, they describe a profile. And when investigators begin to compare that profile against the evidence, something else happens. The threads start to connect. The timeline is no longer just a sequence of hours, it becomes a window shaped by intention. The possibility of a signal jammer is no longer just a technical detail, it becomes part of a preparation phase. The digital searches are no longer curiosity, they become checkpoints. The ransom messages are no longer random, they become controlled communication. And the items recovered during the search becomes something that may sit at the center of all of it. Individually, each element can be questioned. Together, they begin to align. And that alignment creates a different kind of understanding. Not that multiple things happened, but that one thing was built. A plan. Structured. Layered. Carried out. Step by step. Still unconfirmed. Still under investigation. But increasingly difficult to separate into coincidence. And as that structure becomes clearer, another phase begins. Pressure. Because once investigators start connecting dots, once separate lines of inquiry begin pointing toward the same direction, the focus narrows, the margin for error shrinks, and the person at the center of that pattern, whether publicly identified or not, begins to feel it. Some experts have noted that under sustained investigative pressure, behavior often changes. Small inconsistencies appear, statements shift, actions become less controlled, not because someone intends to reveal anything, but because maintaining a constructed version of events becomes harder over time. Stress creates cracks, and cracks create evidence. Right now, the investigation is still in motion. DNA evidence collected from the home is being analyzed, processed through systems designed to compare and identify matches. Digital data search histories, device activity, location signals is being reconstructed, mapped across time to see where it overlaps. The items removed during the search are being examined within that same framework, not in isolation, but in context, compared against everything else investigators already know. Each step is methodical. Each piece is tested before it's trusted, and that process takes time. From the outside, it can feel like nothing is happening. No arrests, no public conclusions, no definitive answers. But inside the investigation, something very different is unfolding. Connections are being made. Possibilities are being eliminated. And a direction is becoming clearer. Not announced, not confirmed, but present. Because when enough pieces begin to fit, not perfectly, not completely, but consistently, the shape of the truth starts to emerge. And even without a final conclusion, that shape can be hard to ignore. The house hasn't changed. It still sits in the same quiet Tucson neighborhood, untouched on the surface. The doors open and close. The windows reflect the same light. From the outside, there is nothing to suggest that anything inside ever mattered to an investigation this complex. No signs, no answers, just stillness. And that's what makes it unsettling. Because while everything looks the same, time has moved forward. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and yet there is still no clear ending, no moment where everything finally makes sense, only a case that continues, without closure. But beyond the investigation, beyond the timelines and evidence, there is something else that hasn't changed. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Her life was built on routine, simple, predictable, grounded. The kind of life that doesn't expect interruption. The kind of life that assumes tomorrow will look like today. And then, one night, that routine stopped. Not gradually, but completely. Somewhere, that absence still exists. Not just in records or reports, but in the lives of the people who knew her. A family, still waiting, still holding on to the space where answers should be. Suspended between what they know and what they don't. If you want the truth to come out, leave a comment with her name. Because sometimes, the truth isn't hidden far away. It's hidden where no one wanted to look.